Here's the wiring diagram for one end of the two-station ring down. We'll show how to assemble this a couple of different ways. Obvious components you're going to need: the 9-volt battery, and a convenient way to connect it is one of these 9-volt battery clips. It just brings it out to wires. You just snap that onto the battery to make your connection. An electrolytic capacitor. I'm not going to show up real good in the picture here. This one's 22 microfarads at 16 volts. I use this because I have a whole bunch of these to use up. 10 microfarads would probably be plenty, or 4.7 would probably do it. All kind of depends on your buzzer. And this is the buzzer I used. It was a very small electronic buzzer. It was made to mount to a PC board, so it just has two little wire pin terminals sticking out of the bottom of it. And there's a little paper seal stuck on the top here. It says remove after washing, and on the tab it shows plus on this end, which corresponds to the longer pin terminal sticking out of it. So if you just remember which pin was positive, could be marked on the case. Then you need a diode like this. This is a 1N4002 rectifier diode. There's a white band painted on one end, which corresponds to what's in the diagram, the top end of the diode with the flat bar on it. And then a resistor. This one's 68 ohms. The color bands on the resistor tell you what the resistance of the resistor is, and you can look up on the internet for color bands, the color resistor code, if you have to decode what your resistor is. So those are the components that you need to assemble it. Then you'll need a little bit of wire. This is 22 gauge stranded wire, or you could just cut up some Cat5 cable and extract the wires out of it. These are twisted together. You can untwist the wires if you need to get individual wires out of it. Either way. So we'll start by taking the buzzer and mounting the electrolytic capacitor across. You'll see that those two components are in parallel. Also note that anything that has a polarity marking, like the positive symbols here for the buzzer, the capacitor, and the battery, polarity is important, as it is with the diode as well. The only thing here that it isn't critical is the resistor. That can go in the circuit either way, it doesn't matter. So we'll take the buzzer and connect the electrolytic capacitor across it. Generally, electrolytic capacitors will have a black marking with a negative symbol showing which lead is the negative lead. The other end, of course, is the positive, and on the electrolytic capacitor they made the positive lead longer. So what I'm going to do is just line this up here and wrap the positive lead around the longer positive lead of the buzzer and have it sticking out, and the same thing with the negative, and then we'll attach the other connections to that. So I'll just wrap this lead around, and we'll hold it up fairly close. Just wrap that lead around, and same thing with the negative lead, wrap it around. If your fingers are big like mine are, sometimes it comes in handy to use a small tool like these needle nose pliers just to wrap the lead around, and we'll hold it together. And then we're going to use some solder to make a good electrical connection, make sure it doesn't come apart where that lead is wrapped around. And then we can trim off the excess if we need to. In this case, I'm going to be snipping off the tail where it's sticking out. I'll zoom in here so you can get a better look at what I've got. We'll move this diagram out of the way for the moment. Let's see if the camera will focus on this. Come on, camera. Maybe I'm zoomed in too far, but I've taken the buzzer and just wrapped the leads of the electrolytic capacitor around the two leads of the buzzer, and I'm going to cut the tails off here because it's a little bit long. I don't need it sticking out that far, but where it's wrapped around I'm going to solder that. I got my soldering iron warmed up. And so it helps take a tool or something to hold things in place. Heat up the joint, apply a little solder, and the other one. Nothing to it. And snip off the excess wire. Okay. And then on the negative side here, negative side of the buzzer and capacitor, we've got the diode connected on there. So that's this side here. I'm going to be adding the diode on. Make sure we get the right end of the diode. I got the band on this end, so it's this end that I want. because it's oriented like that in the diagram. So I'm actually like that. So I'm going to take the diode lead and just wrap that around that pin and solder that on. Might be easier if I just made a nice kink in this. Just made a nice sharp U-turn on this to get me started. Bend it around. I'll solder that. Cut off that extra tail. So I've got the diode attached. Then off the top end of the diode, which is here, we got the resistor and the positive end of the battery. So on the top here, I'm going to make a loop. I'm going to cut that short. Doesn't need to be quite so long. I'll use my needle nose pliers and just form a loop on the end of this. Take my resistor and cut that short. Form a loop on that, which I'm just going to hook through the other loop. So I get them hooked together, and I can close up the loop so they kind of lock together. There's other ways to do it. You could just have twisted them together or some other way to make them connect. But right now I've got those connected together. And I'm also going to take the positive lead from my battery connector, that'll be the red wire, and stick that through the loop, bend the wire over so it's attached. And then to make a good electrical connection, I'll solder that. Let's move this out of the way for a moment. Try to hold things down with the pliers. Okay, so those are connected now. Then off the end of the resistor is one of our line connections. I'll get this back in the picture a little better. Here and here are the two lines going off to the other station. So I can just tack a little piece of wire on here, or we could just attach our line going to the other station here. I'll just make a loop on the end of this where I can connect on the other wire. Flip that off, make a little loop. Flip that around with the pliers, make a little loop on the end. And I've got this piece of wire, I've stripped the insulation off the very end. Just stick that through the loop. Just bend that around. Or like I say, I could have just twisted them together. Either way, but right now they're hooked together. Then I'll solder it so that it stays and makes a good electrical connection. So that'll be one of my lines going out. And And then we also need the connection here at the bottom where the two positive terminals, the buzzer and the capacitor, connect together. I need a line going out. Then I also need the connection going back here to the local telephone. I've got another piece of wire here that I stripped the two ends and also made a bare spot in the middle. So I'm going to just take that and wrap that around the positive terminal of the buzzer, which also connects to the capacitor. I'll zoom in here so maybe you can get a good shot of what I'm doing here. So where I've got the bare spot in the middle of this blue wire, I'll just loop that around the terminal in the buzzer. And then I'll solder that down. Make sure that's secure. Okay. Now I've built this pretty much just the way the schematic diagram has laid it out. I've got the buzzer with the capacitor hooked across it. I got the capacitor sticking that way, it doesn't matter, of course. And off the lower connection I've got two wires. This one would go to the phone. This one is the line going out. And I've got the diode, which is shown here, going up and connecting to the resistor, and then the line going out. And then in the other direction, to the positive side of the battery connector, and the other wire from the battery connector, which is the negative side, goes to the other connection of the local phone. So I will take these two wires and connect them to my local phone. And I've got a block here. This is where my local phone would connect, so I'll just connect these two wires to the local phone. These two wires will go out to the other station, which is wired exactly like this. Connect up the battery, plug the phone into this jack, and we should be able to communicate. Now the other way to build one of these would be a little neater. Now what you would do with this is perhaps wrap it up with tape. You'll have to take this paper off, of course, so you can hear the buzzer sounding. But you'd want to insulate these connections so it can't touch anything and short out. You could maybe build this into a small plastic box, or wrap it up with tape or something to protect these connections so they couldn't touch anything. Okay. Another way that you can assemble this, rather than just putting the components together raw like this, is to use a small printed circuit board. This is called a prototyping board, and what it has is a series of holes that the component leads would stick through. You can kind of see right through it because of all the holes. And on the back side, we'll see if we can focus on it. There we go. There's a small copper pad around every hole. So the components, when you mount the parts to it, like this buzzer, we'll stick the buzzer to the board, and it would just poke through the holes in the board. Okay. And there will be a solder pad around the holes, or around each hole. I'm trying to get it to focus here. There we go. And here's where the leads are sticking through. And I'll bend the leads over to go connect to the leads of the next device I stick in, which would be the capacitor or the resistor, and form the circuit paths along the back side of this. And I can stick the components very close together and then put wires through the holes and run the wires off either to the other station or to the local telephone. So we'll try putting one together this way. These pad control circuit boards are relatively inexpensive. You'll find them on eBay or from any place that sells electronic parts for the experimenter. So we'll put one together this way. This one's obviously much larger than we'll need for the few components we have. And these are easily cut simply by scoring them, cutting them with a knife along a row of holes. And you'll cut it several times to make a groove, and if you can, line up with the same row of holes on the top, and then you can just snap it you know, and you only need something, you know, 3/4 of an inch wide, an inch long would be plenty big for making this circuit. So we'll start by sticking down the buzzer into a set of holes like this, and then next to it we'll put the capacitor. And again, watch which way you put this in here so you get the polarity correct. Okay, so now we've got the buzzer and the capacitor on here. Now what I'm going to do is bend over the leads of the capacitor. And you always want to follow the rows of holes. Never want to go at an angle. You always want to go straight across and then turn and go straight up. Okay, so I'm going to go straight across and then turn and then go 90 degrees and go right alongside the pins of the buzzer, and I can bend those over as well. I'm going to go right along the pin of the buzzer, and then from there my next connection on the positive side is going to be this common line here that's going to be going to the phone and out on the line. So I'm going to need 2 wires connected to this point that I just formed here coming off this buzzer. I can also bend this buzzer lead over as well, and at the end of this, where these 2 lines come up, I'm going to have 2 pieces of wire coming off, one to go to the other station and then one to go to the local phone. So I'll take these 2 pieces of wire, I've already stripped the ends off to save time, and stick them through holes at the end of the board, and then solder them to the ends of the wires, one coming from the capacitor and one coming from the buzzer, which run right next to each other because I bent them over next to each other. So when I solder, these wires will get connected from the buzzer and the capacitor, and then get connected to the ends of these 2 wires that I'm going to stick through the holes at the end of the board here. So we'll stick these 2 wires in and bend the wires over as well, so that they kind of overlap the wires of the components. I'll bend this one over to the side. Get the strands of this wire lined up good so I can get them to poke through the hole. Try to hold them in place while I bend the wires over. Try to keep them to stay in place while I solder those wires down. Not coming out quite as clean as I thought it would, but it'll work. Alright. See if I get this to focus. Okay. Here's the leads that came through from the capacitor. And I bent them both over, and the one comes along and it turns and goes up, and right there is where one of the leads comes through from the buzzer, and they both continue up. And the buzzer lead was pretty short, it ends right here, but the capacitor lead turns and goes across, and this is where the 2 wires came through the board, and they both got bent over, so those are soldered down against the lead of the capacitor, which is also soldered to the buzzer lead. So I've made that connection from the capacitor to the buzzer to the 2 wires. So here's my connection to the capacitor. Oh, need to go wider in the picture. So I've got my connection from the capacitor connecting to the buzzer and to the two wires, one going to the other station and the other one going to the local station here. So that much I've got done. So now I'm going to connect the capacitor to the other buzzer connection and to the diode, which I'll be adding to the board next, and that's going to connect to the resistor and to the battery. So now here's my diode, and I've got two ways I can go with the diode. I could bend both legs over 90 degrees, or I could bend one of them all the way around 180 and stand this up on the board like this with one lead bent all the way down, or I can put the component to the board flat like this with each lead bent over 90 degrees. If I really want to save space, I stand them up, but we've got plenty of room, so I'll just bend each lead over 90 degrees like this and put it down to the board. Now I got to look for that white band and make sure I put it in the correct way. Okay, so I'm putting the diode through the board, and I'm going to bend the lead of the capacitor over so it runs next to the buzzer lead and the lead from the diode. And different people have different methods of using these prototype boards. This is one way that I do it. See if I get this to focus so you can see where I'm at this point. So here we've got the other lead from the capacitor coming along, going across here. Okay, right there, and you really can't quite see it, is the lead from the buzzer, and here's the lead from the diode. Okay, so I'm going to cut this short and bend it over, and also bend over the lead of the buzzer, and then I'll be soldering these together. Putting them down with my thumbnail. So I've got these leads bent down now, and I'll solder them. There you can see them looking at it better now. So I've got the capacitor lead comes over, there's the buzzer lead bent over, and the diode lead bent over after I cut it short. Okay, so now off the end of this diode I have to go through the resistor and to the positive battery connection. I've got my resistor here, and I'm going to lay that one down as well. So I'll just bend the leads over. And I'm going to kind of backtrack with that and put that here on the side of the board. So you can see the leads sticking through here. I've got it lined up with the end of the diode. And then I'm going to take my 9-volt battery wire, and I need the positive lead from the battery, as shown here, to connect to the end of the diode to the resistor, so it'll be the red wire. Also needs to go in there, and I'm just going to stick that right in between the two. So on the back side now, it just pulled out. I'll bend the leads over first. On the back side now I've got the two leads from the resistor sticking through and the lead from the diode. I'm going to bend the diode lead over towards the resistor and pull the resistor lead back over towards the diode, and then I'm going to chop them both off, put because they're much longer than they need to be. We'll zoom in here. If it'll focus, you'll see that they're going to overlap when I bend them all the way down flat to the board. But before I do that, I'm going to poke this red wire in between so it'll get caught up in that, and then I'll solder it down. Actually, I ended up folding that red wire over the top of my cross there so you can see that. When you're soldering, you'll notice I'm touching the solder away from where I have the soldering iron. The joint should be hot enough that the solder, when it touches the joint you're soldering, will melt without having to touch the solder to the soldering iron. Okay, the other end of the resistor now is one of our line connections. So I'm going to be connecting a wire there. That'll be the blue wire, or rather the orange wire going off to the other station. So I'm going to stick that here at the other end of the resistor. Twist the end up a little bit. So I've got the orange wire sticking through here right next to the long resistor wire, which is way longer than it needs to be. So I'll bend the orange wire over towards the resistor lead, and then bend the resistor lead back over. And before I get it all the way flat, I'm going to chop it off. It doesn't need to be anywhere near that long. Just enough so that they overlap, so I can solder them together and make the connection. So I've got them bent over. Put a little solder on that. Okay, so now I'm going to have my orange and blue wires going off to the other station, and then here I've got this blue wire, and the black battery wire would go to the local station. Which is this connection here. Or if I wanted to, I could take this black wire and terminate it down to the board, and then bring another piece of wire off. I'll use a piece of white wire I happen to have handy here to attach to the black wire. I've got a different wire, a little more substantial than the flimsy little wire they give you with the 9-volt battery clip, and it could be longer to run off to the local station. I'll just solder those together. So I've got these two wires to the local station. These two wires go to the circuitry at the other station, connect the 9-volt battery, and you're good to go. Now at this end, I just connect the wires to the connector block for the local station, or however you're going to be wiring up your local phone. Wrap that around the screw. Well, that's about all there is to it. Oh, but then of course we have to test it. So I hooked it up. Here's the one I built on the circuit board. Here's the one I dead bugged and just hooked the parts together. Hook a couple of batteries to it. Hook the two together. Don't forget you have to swap the wires when you hook the two together. Pick up one. This one beeps. Hook this one. Pick this one up. That one beeps. Pick them both up and you talk to each other just like I expected. There you go.